I thought, let me try this pineal meditation and see if that will help. An hour and 45 minutes later, I had been in a state where I could only describe it as like champagne bubbles of joy were bursting all around my body. Just over 12 years ago, I was diagnosed with Merkel cell carcinoma. It is a very rare neuroendocrine form of skin cancer. My then 13-year-old daughter saved my life. It was just after Hurricane Sandy, and we had been out of power. We went home, and we were horsing around. She looked up at me and said, "Hey, Mom, what's that on your nose?" Had she not said that, had I not been checked, I have been told I would not be here. At the time I was diagnosed on New Year's Eve, going into 2013, the average prognosis was 5 months. So my options were to have concurrent chemotherapy and radiation, and what ultimately was 7 surgeries to reconstruct my face. I had a wide area excision of my nose to remove the lesion, which was only 2 millimeters. I had a flap from my forehead and the cartilage from my ear to build me a new nose. Unfortunately, because it was already metastatic, I had my lymph nodes removed, I had a salivary gland removed, and the radiation shut down all of my salivation, and my thyroid, while it's still physically there, has not worked in more than a decade. Through this experience, I had concurrent carboplatin, etoposide, 8-gray radiation every single day for 45 minutes a day for 6 weeks, until finally I got conditions like thrush and I was feeling like I was swallowing glass. I had liver impact, and so they stopped the last round of chemo. They felt, hopefully, that I had had enough. By July of that year, I had my first clean PET scan, and they said, okay, well, when you can eat, you can go back to work. So I went back to work in August. Unfortunately, about a month later, I was in a meeting and my throat started swelling up. My colleague said, "Sue, are you okay? Look, you're getting very, very red and swollen." So I called my oncologist. He said, "Go to the ER." By the time I got to the ER, my throat had exploded in flames. It was closing my airways. I was in the ICU for a week. They thought it was some infection. They started pumping me full of antibiotics and, finally vancomycin, which is one of the strongest. But I still was not improving. So finally at that point, I was like, can you brilliant doctors figure this out? And I texted the one and only doctor, my radiation oncologist. Amazing man. He called me 5 minutes later and said, "Get me the head of infectious disease on the phone. I know what this is. I have a photographic memory. This is called radiation recall. It's a very rare condition that only happens to people who had chemo and radiation at the same time." When they took me off the antibiotics and he said, "Get her on antihistamines and steroids," and I was out of the ICU 6 hours later. I had a very big corporate job, ironically, in healthcare and healthcare research. And so I had done some meditation work, but for whatever reason, I had stepped away from the practice. When COVID happened and I began leading our COVID response, I was working crazy hours, 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., 7 days a week. And so I turned back to the therapist who I had worked with during my cancer treatment. She had said, "I really think you would benefit from Dr. Joe's work. Why don't you start with reading Becoming Supernatural? And why don't you start with doing the blessing of the energy centers?" So I began doing that work. At this point, I still had no sensation, no salivation, and extremely limited range of motion. When I finished my treatment, I could turn to about here. And so driving, I'm a swimmer, it was very challenging. And so I began doing the work, I guess, just about a year ago. I also had done a lot of research on the placebo effect. So I read You Are the Placebo, and I reread Becoming Supernatural. And then I really started doing the blessing of the energy centers every day. In the middle of May, my therapist pinged me and said, DC just opened up, you're doing this now. And I had a crazy schedule. I was booked up in May, but I said, you know what? And I just didn't think, I just did it and I booked. And then I started doing the intensives. So I was like, how am I going to fit in these 23 hours? But I started, I was doing, the lectures and the meditations every day. Even if I was traveling, I would do the morning meditation. And then I heard the story about the woman who had regenerated her thyroid. And I said, wait a minute, if she could grow one from scratch, maybe I can get my little baby butterfly going again. When I got here, I said, okay, I just need to surrender. I don't want to have specific expectations beyond what Dr. Joe's teachings are. But every single day since I've been here, I've had something remarkable happen. Day one, all of a sudden, after the first practice, I'm like, I can turn my neck over my shoulder all the way. I haven't done that in forever. So then I was like, okay, what's next? And then yesterday, when we did the walking meditation, when I got done, I had like a burst of saliva, like nothing I'd ever seen. I mean, I literally was spinning all the way back. I'm like, what is going on here? I had had some trickle, but now since then, I mean, I have been like, I had to have water at all times or I could not speak or eat. And I was a little worried, frankly, that, without the water for the meditation, I didn't even take a water bottle this morning. I did not need it. What maybe is most meaningful to me is the work that I have done all these years has been trying to make sense of clinical science for people. But I was always about others. And so doing this work to myself, I think, is the greatest gift of all. I feel a sense of peace and freedom and liberation that I don't know that I've ever felt in my entire life.